Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, married on a Tuesday, buried on a Wednesday. Here's your look at the McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse, Batman Arkham City, Solomon Grundy. Got ourselves a really nice Grundy. But before we get a close look at the Build-A-Figure Arkham City Solomon Grundy, I'd like to thank the folks over at McFarlane Toys, who did provide not necessarily the sample of Solomon Grundy, but the sample certainly of the other 4 figures we had a look at, and by virtue of that, allowed us to build this monstrosity that we could finally have a look at his own dedicated review. Grabbing now the tape measure just to see how tall Solomon Grundy stands. The figure is a 7.5-inch tall figure, or it's roughly about 19 centimeters in height. Then, to compare Solomon Grundy with the other figures we looked at from this wave, here's what he looks like next to Batman. Here's what he looks like also next to Catwoman. Just off to the side, here's what he looks like next to Penguin. I just dropped his parasol. And here's what he also looks like next to Ra's al Ghul. A good lineup of characters from this wave. And I thought as well I would do one better to bring in other figures as well that have of the larger variety. So let's just move Ra's al Ghul over here. Let's move over Batman. And bring in characters like Destroyer. I wanted to bring in figures at least that were of this size. Destroyer, I think, is a good example of this. Let's get his feet actually standing right. Of course, now he's not going to stand at all. There we go. Also wanted to bring in Lobo because I thought that would be a good size difference. And just in the back, we can also bring in, I don't know if you can see him enough. Of course you can see him. He's a very tall figure. Here's what he also looks like next to Killer Croc. Now maybe we can bring Batman over. Bring over Penguin. Bring over Ra's al Ghul. So Solomon Grundy in this case is a character that's shorter than, say, Killer Croc. He's about the same size, maybe just a little bit tad taller than Destroyer and Lobo, but he's a good-sized build-a-figure that at least is rewarding. There's nothing worse than when you're building a figure and when you're finally finished all of the figures that needed those parts to put together to collect and connect or build a figure. Nothing more disappointing when you got a very small figure. Solomon Grundy, I think, could still have been taller, but he's still a nice, well-rounded figure, and I think he turned out really nice. Because the figure of Solomon Grundy is a build-a-figure after all, it means that he doesn't come included with, unfortunately, any accessories, nor does he come included with a trading card. I didn't mention he didn't come included with a display stand because really, you have enough display stands already with all the other figures we've gotten from McFarlane's team. I don't think a display stand was never crucial, but I do think a trading card would have certainly been nice, being that we already have now 4 figures from Arkham City, all coming with their own dedicated cards. I think at least one of the figures that came included one of his build-up parts could have also came included perhaps with a Solomon Grundy card. That being said, though, getting a closer look at the figure, I'll tell you well in advance, I did have some issues with still attaching the thighs into the pegs. I'm hoping that I have them completely now attached, but I'm going to tell you well in advance, especially when it comes to the articulation portion of things, that when I am moving the legs, I've already noticed a couple of times that the legs do fall off, but I mean, they're simple enough to pop back into place, but I think I have them now permanent. I mean, again, when you are moving the leg back and forth, you even may notice that the leg starts to kind of loosen itself or start sliding down that peg. We'll have to kind of just push these back in. Head sculpt wise, I'm really happy with how this one turned out. Obviously, over the course of the 4 videos we've had a look at, especially the one that had the Solomon Grundy head. We already had a look at the head, but now it gives us a full opportunity to see what this guy looks like with the head on top of the body where it belongs. Now, obviously, in this case, I've opted to include the jacket. Being the fact that really the body was fully finished, you really could leave the jacket off completely if you want to. But to finish the look of the Frankenstein monster that is Solomon Grundy, I feel it's necessary. It's crucial to include the jacket. Not to mention as well, you finally have something to match the pants. Head sculpt, though, I really like the head sculpt on this one quite a bit. Still, though, I feel like Solomon Grundy could probably have been even a tad bit taller, maybe even to about here. But still, though, you get a good sized figure. I'm not disappointed at all with how this one turned out. I do like the grimace on his face, darker colors around the areas of his eyes, so it really helps those eyes really being like a dark gold coloring. It actually looks like his pupils are gold, while the rest of the eye still remains that dark gray. The grimace of his teeth, I also really like this one curl at the top of his lip, that sort of Stallone lip that he's got going on there. And the teeth are nicely brightly painted as well. The hair, what he has of it, is a little more sparser, but at least it's painted differently to the rest of the face. Again, like the darker color really kind of works quite well to Solomon Grundy. I did mention this, though, when we were building Solomon Grundy in the earlier review, at least putting his head onto the socket of the torso, that like the torso is very clearly a lighter color of gray than what we get for the face. I'm not sure really why the face is a darker gray than the rest of his body, but it's close enough as well. And considering, too, Solomon Grundy is a walking corpse, I think I can justify why maybe his head is not quite the same color as the rest of his body. The body has some really cool details going for it. Of course, the stitched up torso that he has is all more of a darker, dingier green. And they've got all these cool little veins that he has all over his body. An opportunity, as always, is present where they probably could have gone in there and washed a little bit of black paint over top. Very thin black paint, just to let some of those features pop up. But at least for a character like Solomon Grundy, I don't expect a whole lot of extra paint being added on there. It's not like a case where you've got a Bane. Bane was, actually, you know what, Bane really would have been a good example of a character I should have brought in for the comparisons, but Bane, I think, was a good example as well as of a character that looked really good, but didn't have as much paint as he really could have afforded. Solomon Grundy, again, because he's sort of got this off-gray coloring, you at least have the benefit of the stitched-in areas painted in green. I got to tell you, the only thing I'm not really as crazy about on Solomon Grundy is the chains that they sculpted and painted around his wrists. Not so much that they sculpted them, but the color that they decided to go with. It's sort of this, it's a kind of a creamier rust color. Instead of actually making it as bright as they would have, I actually would have preferred if it was kind of more of a color of copper. And I think this is way too light. It still looks good on him actually having that. And again, around that, you can see all the additional sculpting of these little veins, the little scratches and little cuts that he has all over his body. It's a really neat looking figure. One thing I also really like about the body here is the jacket. The jacket not only does have sort of a woven texturing to it, but it has like natural wear here too as well. I'm sure it's intentional, but you'll notice here on the back of his torso, I'm trying not to get my fingers all in the way of things, but you'll notice like there's these little areas here that are obviously much lighter than the darker blue that's around it. So it looks like the jacket that he's wearing, what's left of it at least, looks like it has been worn a little bit. It's worn out a little bit. He also has a little bit of the lighter coloring down below there. Nice little touches of detail. I appreciate that. His legs aren't quite the same color as his jacket. The jacket seems like it's a little bit more of a darker blue. He's got the little tied up rope there for the front of his belt. I guess if you could call it a belt. And he's got these cool little tears there. One little tear at the top of his thigh, a more obvious tear there in the opening of his knee. And again, he's got all these little scars, stitched up areas that look like they just decayed on the figure's body. Really, really cool. One thing also I noticed about this figure is that he does have an off coloring for the toes. My guess is it's because he's walking through the mud. Now, he doesn't have any, of course, off coloring on the bottoms of his feet, looking as if he has walked through mud. I'm not really sure why they had to off coloring like that. I almost, in this case, would have just left the paint off completely and just kept the coloring of the gray. In this case, I don't even think they need to paint the toes. Why they painted the toes, I'm not really sure. One thing I did want to mention, though, and it's going to talk more about the articulation of the figure, I'll do it right now, is when you bend the knees, this is the section where, of course, the ripped open areas of his knees are. I wish they could have gone and found a way to go in there and paint this gray. Obviously, when you're bending this would just be a continuation of his kneecap, or at least the top of his, or I guess the bottom of his thigh. I wish they could have colored it here in as well. The downside, though, and as I'm saying that, I also realize, too, that if you were to bend the knee and you keep continuing to bend the knee, any little bit of paint that they would have been able to put in there probably would have started scraping off, because obviously you got plastic on plastic. Would have been nice that they could have included, or what they probably could have done also as well, instead of using the molded plastic of blue, use the molded color of this, like this off gray color, and then just paint the part of the pants in blue. Then you could have still kept this part still in gray. For the articulation on Solomon Grundy, I hope he still stays intact for this. His head rotates all the way around. While you are doing that, obviously one thing, the head's going to pop right off, just because he does have the higher collar of his jacket. Head does look up, though, does look down, rocks back and forth, and somewhat you can rotate it all the way around, although the more you rotate it all the way around, the more easier it is to pop off that ball joint. Arms move forward and back. They're on hinge joints. They are more on the tighter side, and yeah, as you're doing it, the arms are going to pop back out. I actually thought the arms were the most secure part that I attached to the figure. They move forward and back. They do creak. They do click a bit. The figure has a single hinge only in the elbow. He does also have a rotation in that arm as well. Now, actually, the hinge joint is here, but they have the swivel joint further up. Usually is the case when it comes to joints that work both ways, a swivel and a hinge. The elbow also allows, like I said, that forearm to rotate back and forth. The hands also independently rotate back and forth. There's also a hinge joint you can probably see right there that also allows the hands to move forward and back this way. Figure has an upper torso ball joint. It's a little bit more limited, granted, but he does have an upper torso ball joint nonetheless. This lower part of his pants, I guess would be the top of the pants after all, is a softer plastic. They've done that at least to conceal the joint sockets inside. One thing, though, while putting the legs in, I also had to kind of go in there and fish one part of the pants out with a little bit of tweezers, just because it was getting stuck in there. Legs do move forward and back. You can't split them out. They seem to be staying pretty decently. I was actually surprised. I thought the legs would fall out more, but just pop those back in. The figure does have, again, that single hinge on the knee, and he does also have ankle articulation and toe articulation. And yes, you can rock it back and forth also as well. So the figure does do pretty good when it comes to both the sculpting. Paint, yeah, is a little more on, again, the limited side, but I honestly can buy into the idea that Solomon Grundy doesn't necessarily need the paint. He has the off-coloring of the gray plastic anyways. At least the parts that are stitched up, for example, are painted green, so he has the color at least there. Head-wise, at least the paint on the head has been painted, and it's pretty close to the rest of his body. It's a little off, but again, because different parts of his body are going to be decaying at different times or different amounts of time, I buy into the idea again that his head is going to be a little bit different of a color than the rest of his body. Still, though, a nice-looking Solomon Grundy. Once again, we can bring in the other figures we had a look at, minus maybe the other ones we did bring in. Here's, again, Penguin. Here's what he looks like, again, next to Ra's al Ghul, Catwoman, and, of course, the figure we all started with, Batman. A nice wave of figures, I have to say. Even like the Ra's al Ghul, who I honestly was my least favorite figure from this wave, this is a case where I still like all the figures from this set. It's never a case where I feel like I would have bought the figure necessarily solely just to complete Solomon Grundy. If I was to go out and buy each of these figures individually, I don't think I would be feeling like I'm necessarily buying a figure solely just for the arm of Solomon Grundy. I feel like all the figures do really, really well with sculpting and the paint. And of course, like when you're finally finished this, especially if you're a big fan of Arkham City, I think you got a nice little setup to be putting on your shelf. I always thought that Solomon Grundy was a really neat character in the pages of DC Comics. Of course, this iteration from the Arkham City game still keeps pretty faithful to the core idea of what Solomon Grundy should look like from a design standpoint, giving him those big, triangular, bulky shoulders like what you would expect to see from Frankenstein's monster, and all these cool stitches that he has all over his body. He looks like the resurrected undead. Now, what the neat thing about this figure, too, is that, once again, you only needed 4 figures to build Solomon Grundy. Not the case where you had to buy 6 to 8 figures. I always think that's obnoxious when you have to buy 8 figures to buy and build a figure when they only throw in like a head or they throw in a hand. I've seen that several times, actually, with other figure companies. But it seems like really McFarlane's team were all about the idea of rewarding the collectors where you don't have to buy a whole lot of figures. I'm sure we're not going to get just only the first wave of Arkham City, as of course there's tons of other characters they can still tackle. But at least in the case of having to build Solomon Grundy, you only need to get the Batman, the Catwoman, the Ra's al Ghul, and the Penguin. And again, all strong, worthy figures, where none of them felt like they were just fluff throw-in characters just to simply build Solomon Grundy. Solomon Grundy looks like a really good looking figure. There are, again, like few little things that I probably would have touched up, like, for example, the chains that he has wrapped around his wrists. I think they're a little too light of a color. I probably would have just darkened those a bit to make them a little bit more rusted. And while, yeah, admittingly, I can understand why they couldn't have gone and painted in the kneecaps, just when you do hinge those knees, you notice then the bare blue plastic underneath. Other than that, though, a really, really neat looking figure. Could he have been a little bit tad taller? Sure. But for what we actually get here for a pretty posable looking Solomon Grundy that stays together at least most of the time, he make for a nice looking Build-A-Figure that I'm super looking forward to putting on the shelf with the rest of my Arkham City figures. A big thank you once again to the folks over at McFarlane Toys that did provide the samples of all the 4 figures we've had a look at. That is the Batman, that is the Catwoman, Ra's al Ghul, and Penguin to finally complete Solomon Grundy. What do you guys think of the figure? Let me know down below in the comments section, and perhaps let me just throw this out to you, the viewing audience. Of now the 4 figures, because now we've technically looked at all the 4, including now Solomon Grundy, if you were to put them in your top favorite 3, or I guess you'd have to put them in the top 4, how would you put the order of your favorite figure from this wave to your least favorite? And we'll see how many other viewers agree with that list that you're going to put. Let me know down below again in the comment section. And again, if you like this video, hit it with a like. If you're loving the content you're seeing and want to stick around for more, then all you have to do really is hit the subscribe button down below and turn on the bell notification. Popping up also at the very end of this video would be a playlist of other DC Multiverse reviews that I've looked at, as well as another playlist of other McFarlane reviews that I've been looking at over the years as well. And even though we have wrapped up the review right now for the Arkham City figures, rest assured though, don't worry. Turn that frown upside down, my man. Rest assured, though, we will be looking at more DC Multiverse reviews coming your way in the not-so-distant future. And as always, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.